Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The Planning Commission is in session. Ms. Rodriguez, will you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
Commissioner Peugeot.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Jordan. Commissioner Higgins.
Here.
Vice Chair Campanella. Absent. Chair Thompson.
Here. Do we have any of the preliminary matters, any announcements or et cetera?
Yes, Chair Thompson, just a couple of announcements as far as some staff changes in the Planning Division. In my moving over to the Development Review section, we now have another project manager for the new zoning ordinance, and that is Mark Aguilar. He will be taking on the project. And we've filled the vacancy left when John Ledbetter retired, and his position is now, we've hired Deborah Andaloro, who was a city employee previously, and she is now the principal planner for the city.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Next item is review and consideration of the minutes of May 7th and the associated two resolutions. Does anybody have any recommended changes, or do we have a motion to approve? Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was one correction which I gave to Ms. Rodriguez, and which has been made, and which was Sophie. I can't remember her last name at the moment. Anyway, it was a designer, not an architect, so that was changed. So with that correction.
Where is that?
Page 2 of the draft minutes, as I recall, yes. Down toward the bottom, Sophie Calvin, architect. And I noticed, I guess I was a bit surprised to see that she was a designer and not an architect. So that but with that correction, I would move to approve the minutes as corrected.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Does that include the resolutions?
Yes.
Okay, including the resolutions. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the minutes and resolutions are approved. The next item on the agenda is a concept review for 800 Santa Barbara Street. This is comments only. We're taking no action. The action will be at the HLC in the future. So, Ms. Galarte, over to you.
Yes, Chair Thompson, the report will be given by the project planner, Suzanne Regals.
Chair Thompson and Commissioners, the project before you is a priority housing project developed under the AUD program. Before I present the project, I would like to go over a brief overview of the AUD program. In December 2011, the AUD program map was adopted along with the general plan update. Prior to the adoption of this map, there was an ad hoc subcommittee that closely looked at the map, and it evolved over time. And they reviewed this map approximately 15 times between 2010 and the adoption in 2011. If we need to get into that further, how this map evolved, Ms. Galarte can help me with that background information. On July 30th, 2013, the City Council approved the average unit density program ordinance, which carries out key implementation action of the city's 2011 general plan. Its intent is to support the development of smaller, more affordable residential units near transit and with an easy walking and biking distance of commercial services and parks. It also increases the density and development standard incentives allowed in multifamily and commercial zones and encourages new housing opportunities for the city's workforce as rental, employer-sponsored, and limited equity housing, cooperative units. Land use policy LG6 speaks to encouraging new residential units in the multifamily and commercial areas of the city, with the highest densities to be located in the downtown, La Cumbre Plaza, 5 Points area, and along Milpas. The AUD program is in effect for 8 years, or 250 high-density residential or priority housing overlay units. Applications that are deemed complete before this project or program expires would be allowed to continue to be processed. As of May 11th, we have 220 units that are in process or approved. with 0 units being constructed and issued a certificate of occupancy, just so you know where we are with that respect to that number. Is PC required for all AED units? How can a project get here? By design review board referral, an applicant's request, or by the ordinance requirement. This ordinance requirement requires that rental housing project sites that are designated high-density residential or are being developed under priority housing and are 15,000 square feet or greater are required to come through a PC concept review during the review process. This is the flow chart of how this process is to work. The project is submitted. It is then assigned a case planner. It goes through its first conceptual review at the design review board, which is a noticed hearing. At the same time or after that review, the applicant would apply for a PRT review, pre-application review team, where the team would analyze the project to make sure that it's consistent with the zoning ordinance, the general plan elements, and staff would prepare a memo about general plan consistency for design review. The second conceptual design review is actually an optional choice. The applicant can choose to forego that and go directly to Planning Commission. The Planning Commission review is for comments only. The Planning Commission's role is to confirm general plan consistency, and then the project would return with those comments to the design review board level for final approval of the project. This PC concept review does allow the PC as well as the public to review this as a conceptual level project before too much development has occurred, and provides the necessary feedback and direction to staff, the HLC, in this case, HLC, regarding the project design and improvement, as well as the consistency with the general plan. One of the tools the HLC and the Planning Commission can use is the project compatibility analysis that's outlined in the municipal code. These are the main topics that are discussed in that analysis, including compliance with the city charter, municipal code, and consistency with design guidelines, compatible architectural character of the city and neighborhood, appropriate size, mass, bulk, height, and scale, sensitivity to adjacent landmarks and historic resources, public views of the ocean and mountains, and use of open space and landscaping. Now to move on to my presentation on the project. This project is located at the corner of Santa Barbara and East De La Guerra Streets. As you can see, it's indicated by the star and surrounded in white on the aerial map. The lot is zoned C2, commercial zone. It has a general plan designation of commercial, high-density residential with a priority housing overlay. This is a view looking east on De La Guerra Street to the project site. The project site ends about where the back of this Prius is and continues on down. This is a view looking north as you're driving up Santa Barbara Street to the project site on the right. The flagpole is on the subject site. There was a previously approved project on the site which received Planning Commission and City Council appeal. It expires in September of 2016. It included the demolition of the existing office building and construction of a 3-story mixed-use building containing 6 residential units and 2 commercial condominiums. Sorry, need to get a drink. The discretionary approvals for this previous approved project were a lot line adjustment, tentative subdivision map, and development plan approval. The original approval was valid for 2 years, and it was extended by 3 2-year time extensions by the governor's office. Prior to the expiration of this project, if this project was to move forward, it would require Historic Landmarks Commission approval and building permit issuance. While this project is that's being reviewed today is a new project and should be reviewed on its own merits, there were some key issues that were discussed during the previous project review, including the height of the building relative to the protection of mountain views, the protection of the historic sandstone site wall, and impacts to the axial brick path, radial staircase, and flagpole that connect the building next door at 223 East De La Guerra Street that's occupied by Sonos to the Santa Barbara Street frontage, and the findings that were contained in the archaeological report, which were the subject of the original appeal to council. This new project involves the demolition of the existing office building and construction of a 22,000 square foot, 4-story building that will contain 26 rental units, 1,500 square feet of commercial. It provides 30 underground parking spaces and 26 required bicycle parking spaces. And it will only require the discretionary approval of the Historic Landmarks Commission. I wanted to note here that the site plan that you have, or the floor plan that you have for the basement level parking garage, does show 32 parking spaces. Transportation staff reviewed that plan. It did not include any accessible parking spaces, turnaround maneuver for if the parking lot was full. And so they redesigned that, and they came to an agreement with transportation staff for a parking lot that works with 30 spaces. That's the discrepancy between the plans and the report. As you can see, these are the density tables that are in the program ordinance requirements, and the applicant is proposing to maximize the development potential of affordable units on the site at 63 dwelling units per acre. The average unit size is 789 net square feet. Here's a project comparison between the existing approved and proposed project. You can see that the proposed project is 26 units over what currently exists, 20 units over what was previously approved. It's an increase of 13 bedrooms from the approved project. The unit sizes have roughly doubled in size, or decreased in size by half. I've read it the wrong direction, sorry. And the commercial has been cut from 4,600 square feet to 1,500 square feet. The approved building height was approved at 37 feet, and the proposed is 44 feet 6 inches. That's a difference of 7.5 feet. They're providing 6 additional parking spaces over what was previously approved, and they are providing 22 new bicycle parking spaces. The project as proposed does meet all zoning ordinance requirements for setbacks, open yard, building height. The setback in the AUD projects in this commercial zone are 5 feet for the front. That would be the frontage along Santa Barbara Street as well as De La Guerra Street, and 0 for the interior and rear setbacks. They are providing 15% open space on the ground level, similar to what is required in the R3, R4 zones, and a 20 by 20 area on the ground level. Speaking to general plan consistency issues, staff's report indicated that they had concerns regarding the historic resources element with respect to preservation of historic resources, preservation of the historic neighborhood character, sensitivity to the historic resources, and sensitivity to El Presidio de Santa Barbara State Historic Park. In the environmental resources element, we had a protection of mountain views that were carefully scrutinized under the previous review with a building that was 7.5 feet shorter. The conservation element, we had concerns regarding the maintaining of mature trees and landscaping. And with respect to the noise element, the compatibility of uses when you're citing a new residential unit uses in non-residential zones, and the compatibility with the adjacent land uses that are existing. The historic resources element does have an implementation action, HR 2.8, which speaks to employing buffer zones around historic resources to further protect those resources. There is a requirement for a 100-foot buffer around any landmark, structure of merit, the state park, to ensure further protection of the historic resources. So this is a map that was included as Exhibit E of your staff report that indicates the locations of landmarks in blue, adobes that are the striped coloration of orange and yellow, which are also landmarks, green for structure of merit, yellow for potential structures of merit, and then the orange indicates buildings that were built before 1945 that have not been evaluated at this time. The darker gray towards the center of the image is the original El Pueblo Viejo landmark district that has since been expanded. The red outline towards the center, right here, is the original Presidio polygon, the basic footprint of where the original Presidio was located. The second part of the HR 2.8 implementation action is the 250-foot buffer from El Presidio Park, as well as other landmarks that are to be determined. I've drawn a 250-foot buffer around the park boundary and indicated where the project site is within that buffer. There is, I'm sorry, I got to look at my notes. There is a clause in that implementation action that there should be further protection that may include reduction in size, height, bulk, scale, and setbacks of the project in this particular buffer zoned area. Here is a view from De La Guerra Plaza as you're looking east towards the project site, which is there at the end of the yellow arrow. You can kind of see the tree here that is at the project site, and the mountains beyond, so that you could see how it is viewed from a public viewpoint towards the mountains. This is a view looking west on East De La Guerra. The driveway entry to the project is located here. This is a view looking down the shared driveway. The new driveway or basement parking garage will be in this general area. And the 4-story element of the proposed project is near this flagpole. These are just additional neighborhood views to the south and east, views to the west and north of the site. My staff report also indicated that we were looking for consistency with Chapter 5 of the El Pueblo Viejo Design Guidelines, which speaks to landscaping and plants. There are some climate buffering guidelines that are in the HLC rules and procedures guidelines, as well as the EPV guidelines speak to providing deciduous trees to allow for summer shade and winter sun on southwesterly exposures. And this should be given specific emphasis in the El Pueblo Viejo district. Also, the site planning should consider the location of backflow utility meters and equipment vaults required for the project and provide adequate landscape screening of such improvements. The urban design guidelines speak to functional relationship between the development and pedestrians, encouraging activity along the street and the building frontage. That should be incorporated in the original design of the building, as well as creating visually unified street spaces, planning the orientation of buildings and building setbacks to enhance the character of the street. And this is contained in Policy 3. We do have some outstanding design issues that are not indicated on the site plan, such as the utility metering. If a electric transformer is required for this project, because it is 26 new units. The equipment junction boxes or vaults that are needed for electric, water, gas, cable, telephone, etc. The fire backflow device location, and the trash and recycling enclosure that can be accessed by the trash company. The Historic Landmarks Commission reviewed the project on May 6th, and they have some extensive comments. We did provide you a copy of the minutes that were ratified at yesterday's HLC meeting. But in short, the project, as proposed, was found to be not acceptable. A lot of the comments that came out of the HLC's review are related to preservation of the historic neighborhood character, as well as protection of the adjacent historic resources. You can see that they felt that the setbacks were too narrow, although the project is proposing 2 to 3 times the minimum setback that is required along both the Santa Barbara and De La Guerra street frontages. The size, bulk, and scale are not appropriate for this site, and the massing needs to be reduced, and the number of stories, particularly concerned with the 4th story, were found to be unacceptable or unsupported. the commission felt that the AUD should be appropriately applied to the site. They didn't rule out the use of AUD, that just maybe the project shouldn't be developed to the maximum development potential of 63 dwelling units per acre. I think that was what they were struggling with, the overall mass and bulk, because of the program that was being proposed. They asked that the central courtyard be restudied. They asked that the architectural style be restudied because they felt the current proposal was too contemporary, and that the north elevation along Anacapa School property line should be treated as primary elevation and not a backup house. They were concerned about the loss of vegetation, significant trees, as well as the landscaping should tie the project back into the neighborhood, and that the multi-use aspect, especially the commercial component, should take into consideration the livability of the neighborhood and the project. During the review, they did speak about what that commercial component is, and it was not identified what that project is. Some suggested it might be a corner market so that people within the development might use it. But whatever it is, it should be compatible with the residential uses above. Since the project was noticed for Planning Commission, we received 6 written letters that were in opposition to the project as currently designed. We did have several speakers, as you can read in the minutes, from HLC at the time of the May 6th hearing. And again, some of these letters did contain comments that they weren't against the AUD program. It just felt like this project was too much for this site. The environmental review, prior to the HLC's environmental or final action, the applicant is aware that he needs to provide an addendum to the previously accepted historic structures and sites report and addendum that were accepted by the HLC that identifies the current scope of work and evaluates whether the current project has significant impact on the existing on-site and adjacent historic resources. They also need to refine the scope of work and identify if there are any areas of new ground disturbance so staff can evaluate whether there's a need for additional archaeological documentation. Under CEQA section 15183, which is a sort of exemption for projects that are found to be consistent with the city's general plan, I'm going to read from this section. CEQA mandates that the projects which are consistent with the development density established by the existing zoning, community plan, or general plan policies for which an EIR was certified shall not require additional environmental review except as might be necessary to examine whether there are project-specific significant effects which are peculiar to the project or its site. This streamlines the review of such projects and reduces the need to prepare repetitive environmental studies. That is why we're asking for the project-specific information of the addendum to the Historic Structures and Sites report, as well as possible further documentation on the archaeological impacts if there's new ground disturbance that wasn't evaluated with the previous project. If the project is found to be consistent with the general plan, then we can use this exemption category, and the decision maker would make a finding at the time of approval that the project is found to be consistent with the general plan, and all the policies or findings remain applicable for the project. In summary, the HLC felt there were general plan consistency issues with respect to neighborhood compatibility, the preservation of mature landscaping and trees, compatibility with adjacent resources, and the project livability with respect to the noise and uses. Staff seeks that the Planning Commission provide feedback related to the project's design and improvements and the general plan consistency. And I have provided the chair with some possible straw vote questions if he needs that as guidance. But basically, we'll go back to the PowerPoint that I have on general plan policy consistency issues and uses that as a framework to communicate your comments back to the Historic Landmarks Commission. With that, I will turn the presentation over to the applicant who can present the actual design of the project and his proposal.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hockhauser?
Okay, I'd like to say good afternoon to members of the commission and the public. We're here for a conceptual review of 800 Santa Barbara Street, and at my side here is the owner of the property and the applicant, Mr. John Donaldson. And maybe John would like to introduce himself to the commission.
My name's John Donaldson, and I'm the current owner of 800 Santa Barbara Street.
So if the commission has any questions of either myself or John, we're certainly happy to indulge them. I think when Mr. Donaldson purchased the subject property, he was very aware of the existing approval for the 6 luxury condominiums. They are condominiums, not rental units, and the commercial square footage. But the city made us aware of the average unit density program and the high need and demand for rental housing with the city. And also, I might like to burnish the program and the effort that was undertaken to create the average unit density program. As staff just reported, there was significant review and effort of the map at the selected sites. And that being said, I feel it's really important to underscore that today's hearing is not about an appeal. This is not an appeal. We're here for feedback. We're here to help understand the policies. We're here to help elucidate, if we can, the real nature of this site and the context which we find ourselves, both the politics, the stakeholders' interest, and the ability, we believe, to kind of implement a successful multifamily rental project on this site and find consistency with the general plan. So that being said, I would like to move forward into our presentation. Really what I see happening here, based on the HLC commentary and the AUD program, is that there's these conflicting policies within the plan. And I personally am asking this commission to kind of look at the context, give us some sincere feedback if they think they want this applicant to pursue the average unit density program on this site, given what we learn and share about it today, or whether it's, in the end, not going to be applicable. I think the site and the design being proposed has a lot of benefits and a lot of good features, but it has to exist in an economic continuum to be viable. And we understand that in general, after a lot of review, both the council and the commission has come to conclude that the average unit density program is worth pursuing. So that being said, I'll go forward into our presentation here. Let's try to get this thing to work. There we go. So just going through without wasting a lot of time, are the slides of the existing context. And I think this is one of the most important ones in the presentation here today that we have. Before you have in the red, in the shaded red, are the actual boundaries of the historic park. This is what the state has as the Presidio Park. And then the dashed line around that is the 250-foot buffer from the park. The yellow shaded structures within that 250-foot buffer and beyond are significant structures of scale and height that already exist in this 250-foot buffer. 800 Santa Barbara Street is visible as a striped shaded site immediately on the southeast side of the park there. And I use this because I really feel it's fair and appropriate, given the desire to implement the AUD program and recognize the historic resources, that the proposed project be evaluated in context of what exists in the neighborhood around it. And I think one of the things that the Commission needs to provide us with feedback on is the idea of what is context. Is it the immediate adjacent structure, a one-story shed, or is it a block away, or is it the structures within the buffer? That's important to evaluating what size, bulk, and scale is. I think, we as the applicant naturally, we believe that there's plenty of good evidence to, and I'm not speaking specifically to our proposal, but I think there's enough evidence in the history and the development of the city around the Presidio that there's opportunity to implement some structure of size, bulk, and scale that achieves or largely achieves the goals of a multifamily housing project consistent with the AUD guidelines. So that's what this slide is about. We'll return to it in more detail. But I'd like to point out that the heavy, bold yellow around structures, those are of significant height, 3 and 4 stories. And then the ones that are just shaded in lighter yellow are significant 2+ stories in height. So when staff says that it's a 1 and 2 story context, I have significant evidence, and in addition to this map that was prepared, we've gone through these neighborhoods and photographed structures, all of them in fact, for the record, to illustrate that there's room if we're to be consistent with the scale and character of the existing neighborhood. Some of these are within that border and some are immediately outside. So I think the question is begged is, are we asking this property to do something less, acknowledging the sensitivity that's required? Is there some standard? We recognize that we're going to evaluate this from all the policies in the general plan of views, sensitivity to its neighbors, architectural character, no question. But does this site present an opportunity with a parking lot, a structure that's going to be removed, done right, to implement some mass, some volume in our environment that's consistent and compatible with what's going on around that? Or are we asking for reductions from that now? Are we at a point in history with the implementation of the AUD program where this site is going to be asked to not do what's being done for many years all around the Presidio? One of the things that I take a little umbrage with, polite umbrage if I will here, is that I recall, I don't have the minutes from HLC in front of me, but one of the first comments on the minutes, the first one was commending the thoroughness of our presentation. The second one, that where the setbacks were appreciated, and I'm trying to get clarification on this right now, but at one point I thought we had some kind of favorable commentary on the amount of setback.
You can keep proceeding.
Okay.
Mr. Hockhauser, just proceed with your presentation, and we'll get into that later.
All right. Well, anyway, there's a landscape plan here, and what I'd like to get into quickly is that, we recognize the importance of landscaping. The proposed footprint, going back one slide real quickly here, is that this border of along Delaware Street is actually providing more landscaping than exists right now. The setback along Santa Barbara Street is greater than that is in the approved project along the northern end there, and our setbacks from the Anacapa School are greater than what was proposed in the approved project. So a lot of the interior is already building or parking lot. We're preserving the greatest extent of perimeter landscaping, and we're proposing to introduce significantly more. So I think there's an opportunity to implement a project here that's consistent with the goals, landscape goals in the general plan that HLC would review and find acceptable. These are the slides showing the subterranean parking, which we worked out with transportation, the first floor plan. And at this level of concept review, we're thinking, yes, all the historic features that are important are being incorporated and preserved, the stone wall at the perimeter, the flagpole, the historic steps and walk. And then as you go up in height, second story, a diminishing third story, and a smaller fourth story. The fourth story element represents 15% of the site area. The third story is 25% of the site area. And there's the roof plan. In our work, we did, I think, a fairly good job of reaching out to the stakeholders and hearing their concerns. During those interchanges, we didn't really get any feedback at that time. Until HLC, it was like your building's too massive. But up until that point, our work with the stakeholders was how do you articulate the elevations? How do you address our privacy issues? There were concerns about shadows. So this elevation is facing north, the Anacapa School, and the feedback that HLC gave us on this elevation, not talking about height or anything, was to make it more engaging, more fenestration. This is the elevation facing east with the four-story element there across the back. This is the De La Guerra Street elevation, and this is Santa Barbara Street elevation showing the mass at the back of the site. And this is a little simulation showing the incorporation of the building from Santa Barbara Street. This is without the building. This is looking up De La Guerra Street. You can see the fourth floor mass. And then without the building. And this slide, again, going back to this slide, this implements on the site, the relative proposal. You can see the heavy outlines for the fourth-story mass, then the third-story mass, and then the more compatible two-story massing along the street frontages. When one evaluates the guidelines from the standpoint of historic resources and design review, you talked about 3.17, where buildings are set back from the public right-of-ways. Well, we're exceeding the recommended setbacks considerably, as much as 3 times. More than the context. I might add that all up and down the Presidio and on the streets all around it, rarely do we get setbacks like that are being proposed by this project. Corner buildings shall be designed to enhance the character and pedestrian activities of the entire intersection, taking into consideration the contributions of all the other existing corner buildings. Well, I think relative to the other buildings that are happening immediately on adjacent corners, not including the parking lot across the street, but the historical museum and the business commercial buildings at the corner of De La Guerra and Santa Barbara Street, we're stepping back more, we're terracing our mass more, so there's a way to find consistency with that policy. And then 3.2.2, avoiding siting corner buildings with their primary mass at an angle to the corner. Again, I think this project endeavors to do just that. And then finally, 3.2.3, when siting a new building, consider the setbacks and scale of the existing neighborhood and adjacent buildings. And that brings us back to this debate and discussion that we'll have on what sensitivity is act when you're in this big blue square that's a big major part of the AUD program to the right there. That's all low one-story buildings. So does that mean that we dictate the future of development in that big blue square by saying everybody has to be one story because their neighbors are one story there? That's not the way development has been happening in the city. It's a matter of sensitivity to the neighbors. We're working with HLC and this body to develop a solution that's terraced and tiered to best address our neighbors. We've got setbacks. We're terracing mass on the upper stories. We're working with shadow studies to really make the glove fit here. And I think there's enough evidence that of what's going on that we could fit in that pattern of development. So again, what is the context, and where do we draw the context from? With regard to historic resources, it's accepted that we're going to incorporate all the important historic features of the site. The retaining wall, the flagpole, the steps. Unlike the previous application that was approved, this application will be required to do a Phase 2 archaeological analysis before the application is deemed complete. And that was something we worked out with staff, and staff said will be a requirement, and we're willing to do that. So a lot of these details about utilities, some of the refinements that staff has brought up will be incorporated as we go through the process. So again, it underscores we're just in a dialogue here. This is not an appeal. This is a concept discussion. And we want to get some direction so we can work successfully with the bodies and the committees that are involved. This slide here just illustrates the relative percentages of the site that are being utilized. That fourth-story mass is 15% of the site. And third story, as I said, was 25%. And the overall building represents about a 64% of the site, especially given that there is all subterranean parking. And then this is a series of shadow studies that were done in our dialogue with the school to show the shadows at different times of the day. This is spring and fall, the spring and fall equinox at 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. This is the summer, showing the shadows cast. And then here you've got the winter. And existing vegetation on the property line with the school. And then this is a simulation and shadow study of the approved project at 9 a.m. in the winter solstice. This is not the proposed project. This is what's approved. And these are the previous plans that are approved now and have an entitlement on the property. I think I've pretty much given us enough material to get into a discussion, hear from the public, members of the HLC. I just want to summarize that, from what we see in our evaluations and study, we think there is a successful project here. It just takes some realistic assessments and hard work on the part of all the stakeholders. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Mr. Hockhauser. Now, I'd like to ask Mr. Mahan, who represents the HLC. I'm assuming you're here to represent the HLC, to speak to us on what the HLC's position is, and then we'll see if there's any questions by any of the members of the commission for the staff or the HLC or the applicant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. It's good to be back here again and represent the Historic Landmarks Commission. The minutes that were presented to us yesterday at the beginning of the meeting, the commission did not find acceptable. And so after a grueling, about a 6.5-hour meeting, we had a lot of projects, a lot of complicated projects yesterday. We still took time to go over the minutes and to correct them, and these are unanimously approved by all of the commissioners who were at the former meeting where Mr. Hockhauser made his presentation. And I'd like to just go over them briefly, and you could stop me along the way if you'd like to ask questions. But we divided our minutes into 6 categories: the proposal, the setbacks, size, bulk, and scale, architectural design, landscaping, and the mixed-use issue. And under proposal, we had 2 comments to make. And the first one, and the most important one, is that the project as proposed is not acceptable. We feel a very strong responsibility to not lead an applicant in a direction that we feel ultimately will not be successful. And as Mr. Hockhauser said, there's an approved project for this site. Of course there is. And we want to work with the applicant to make sure that we find the best solution. But the one that was presented was not. The second comment was the thoroughness of the AUD and solar presentation is appreciated. We thought he gave us a very good presentation, and I think he's given you a very good presentation on those particular issues. In terms of setback, the proposed setbacks from the street are appropriate and extremely important, but they are too narrow. The commission felt that as a building gets taller, the setbacks have to respect that. Across the street, the 1-story building or 1.5-story buildings, maybe I have no setbacks, and that's acceptable. But this was a tall building that was presented to us, and we couldn't accept it. The side and rear setbacks from the historic resources are not appropriate to the site. We were especially concerned with how the project didn't relate to the Anacapa School. And we think that's just as important as a street facade as far as we're concerned. The young people come out from Anacapa School and they use that south yard when they're in recess, and we think that the approved project will have to be respectful to that particular use, and we didn't think that this particular design met that criteria. The next category was size, bulk, and scale. We felt the size, bulk, and scale are not appropriate to the site. This is a very sensitive site. A block by the crow flies from the Presidio, right across the street, the historical museum, a very, very important building. The architectural resources around this site are very important, and we want the approved design to be respectful of those. The proposed height is not compatible with the surrounding neighborhood with its 1- and 2-story buildings. The commission finds the 4th story unsupportable. So I think we want to send a message to the applicant that a 4th story is not acceptable. Let's see. The massing needs to be reduced. The density of the proposed number of units should be appropriate to the site, neighborhood, and adjacent historic resources, notwithstanding that the AUD would be allowed. The AUD should be appropriately applied to this site and neighborhood. Our vice chair, Barry Winnick, went to the workshop on AUD, and so he's very familiar with AUD, and he felt that the issue of AUD on this site isn't the problem. The problem is that this site can't be maximized, and it's just not the appropriate place. And you could see from staff's report. By the way, that's a very nice report. That most of the AUD is used up already. It's going to sunset in a few years, and El Pueblo Viejo is not going to sunset. It's in the charter. It'll be here forever. So the next category was architectural design. The design is too contemporary and should be restudied. We felt that the Presidio and the historical museum set the style that would be very appropriate for this site. More of an Adobe style, and not the big courthouse kind of Spanish colonial revival. The design is too contemporary. The architecture should be compatible with the historic context of the neighborhood. The project should respect the adjacent historic resources and should be compatible with the neighborhood. restudy the courtyard concept, look to the historic El Paseo courtyard for inspiration. We believe the courtyard is appropriate on the site. We just didn't think that the way it was presented here is the right solution, and so we just didn't accept that. The north elevation should be treated as a primary elevation and not as a back of house. This is the north elevation. It faces the Anacapa School. It is viewed from the significant historic resource and is adjacent to the Anacapa School, which is diminutive in scale. That's a very important consideration for us, how this relates to that particular neighbor. Landscaping, the loss of landscaping is a concern. Significant trees on the site should be retained. Landscaping should be used to tie the project to the neighborhood. And the last category was mixed use. The multi-use aspect, especially the commercial component, should take into consideration the amenities. I noticed that in the presentation it used the word livability, but the commission decided to use the word amenities to consideration of the amenities of the neighborhood and the project and the needs of future residents. We think that the amenities of the neighborhood needs to be considered. And of course, when I was on Planning Commission, this is something that we really considered, the amenities of the neighborhood. Are there parks there? Where will the children play? Can you get to grocery stores? Is traffic, is transportation available, et cetera? These things all need to be considered. So these were our minutes. They were, as I said, they were approved unanimously, and fortunately, I was picked to come and make a presentation to all of you. And if you saw me panting when I came in, it was because the parking structure is closed, and I had to park down at the Community Development Building and walk up here in 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Any commissioners have questions for Mr. Mahan or the staff or Mr. Hockhauser? Start with Ms. Peugeot. And Mr. Mahan, if you want to just seat over there, and that'll be
maybe
fine.
He could wait a minute to sit down, because I do have a question for Mr. Oh, I see at the mic. Okay. I do have a question. I'm not sure, maybe comments by both Mr. Mahan and Mr. Hockhauser might work. I would like a little more information on the commercial component that's proposed. I don't really feel like we got much of a presentation about that, what's intended. We know the square footage. Where is it situated? How's the access? And also interesting, Mr. Mann, when you mentioned, when I was reading through the revised minutes, your item 14 on the commercial component, I think you elaborated very well. I understand it a lot better now, because I believe, at least in your presentation, what you're saying is it's the needs of the future residents of the proposed project, but also the residents of the neighborhood, which I didn't quite get when I read that last item 14 in the minutes. So I assume that's
yes,
more or less a clarification of what.
I think when I think of a commercial element in a residential development, I think of this the one down on Yananali that has a little corner grocery store, kind of delicatessen or whatever it is on Yananali, and I don't know what the other street is, but we would like that, or the I can never think of the name of it, the new project across the street from the Victoria Theater, where they have that corner, that's a big corner grocery store. But I mean, those kind of facilities really benefit the neighborhood, and they benefit the people that live in that particular residential complex. And I'm sure that Mr. Hockhauser can make that happen and make that corner, make that corner really work and be lively and an asset to the neighborhood.
Yeah, thank you, June. Yeah, that we haven't worked out that detail yet. We don't know who our tenants are going to be for the residential units, let alone the commercial space we're designating, because we're just in a very conceptual phase. We think, as so many Santa Barbans do, that this would be a wonderful place to live, that this is kind of creating housing at this location with the amenities and Handlebars Coffee around the corner, and this institution right up the street, and, you know, Paseo Nuevo, another block away, is fabulous, and what cities everywhere are endeavoring to do. So I appreciate Bill's confidence that we could find a great use for the commercial space that we have there. So that's the answer to your question. I do have a burning desire to say a couple other things that are...
Well, actually, it doesn't quite answer my question. Could you just spend a few minutes on the site plan pointing out where the commercial spaces are, how many units they are, in your concept plan? Do they have doors out to the street? Are they intended for general commercial use or more for, ease of use of the residents, that sort of thing?
Okay, so on this slide here to the right, I'm sorry I didn't bring my laser pointer, but on this slide to the right, that pink on the corner is intended to be some form of commercial space that's accessible from the street on that level only. So this is the grade level site plan. The sandstone wall would be maintained around the perimeter, only interrupted to allow access to that little commercial shop, whichever it is, and the access to the interior of the project. So there's a little mini plaza out on the front on Santa Barbara Street that will allow residents to walk through the project on a pathway by the flagpole to the back of the project, kind of in alignment with the fountain in the project behind. Then on the interior there is a little green courtyard space that as you go up on upper levels of the project, the circulation of the project wraps around. There we go. So you can see the courtyard's maintained on all levels.
But my understanding, sorry, the commercial's only on the first floor, right?
Correct.
So just being interested in the commercial right now, there's that one walkway entering in. So is it your proposal that it's one space and you leave to a future tenant whether or not to divide it up, or is there just one entrance there?
It's a rather small space, so we don't envisage having any subdivision of that commercial space into more than one tenant. And our expectation was that it would not be probably not be a grocer, given the parking issues and things like that, but be more like a small office space, insurance, psychiatrist, whatever.
And it's the entirety of the pink area is the 1,500 square feet?
About, right.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. And Mr. Chair, did you want me to move on with my questions to staff?
Yeah, questions
or did you
for
want
staff
to,
or the applicant or the HLC. Let's get the questions out now.
Okay, great.
Before we go to public testimony.
Okay. So for staff, if you could just very bullet point fashion, just kind of outline the CEQA environmental review process. From what I understand, the additional studies that will most likely be requested, particularly the historic addendum and phase 2, I think, archaeology report, and I'm not sure if there's another one. Those will be done following our planning commission prior to going back to historic landmarks, because the entirety of the environmental review process will be completed by the time it goes back to landmarks. That's where I'm getting a little bit fuzzy. And then also just finally, my understanding is that our commission here today does not focus on environmental review issues, but the policy issues. If you could just kind of make sure I'm in line there with that.
Yes. So the applicant, due to the number of concerns that were raised by the HLC, they may choose to go back to the HLC at least one more time before they prepare their addendum to the historic structures and sites report, as well as proceed with the archaeology report, phase 2. We wouldn't want them to go a number of times before they prepare those reports, but they would not be able to receive project design or final approval until those reports had been reviewed and accepted by the Historic Landmarks Commission. With respect to the Planning Commission's review today, it is to focus on the general plan consistency issues and provide feedback to staff in the HLC on consistency.
And follow on to that. But what I believe I understood, what I thought I heard in today's presentation, anyway, is just to clarify that you haven't yet, staff has not yet decided what level of environmental document may be needed, that you need those additional studies, and also the feedback from the commission on our policy discussion. And then when all that is done, you will make a determination of whether it's exempt or an addendum itself or a negative declaration, et cetera. That's yet to be decided, depending on all that information.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And I just one small question, and it really is small. It's just it's on my radar screen, and I do believe and intend to keep my comments to the broader policy picture today. But there was some information by the Transportation Division in here about the types of improvements, given this proposal, that would potentially be required, and signals were part of it. And so I just have to ask, because I'm very sensitized to this, what is the Type B signal? Is that another mast arm?
Unfortunately, I don't know what a TV signal is.
Okay. It just as a reminder, and my expression of when I review it, the policies apply to the streetscape as well as the building and the site and the context. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to let some of my colleagues go first, but this is fine. Mr. Vincent, I have a question for you. From the presentation we received from Ms. Regal, there are a couple of slides. Well, it's on page 3 of our handout, but one slide is entitled Previously Approved Project, and another slide is New AUD Project. Now, in both of these slides, there's a bullet point that states that the demolition of office building. This office building is 1,965 square feet. So if I'm reading this correctly, is that that's a non-issue then for consideration under the new project, because what's already been approved by the city for the property? And the reason I'm asking this, Mr. Vincent, is I thought this was the building that has a potential designation for historic merit. No, a different building?
And I would direct you to Ms. Regal.
Okay.
For that information.
Maybe my question is a two-parter. Is that, in the first part,
I would direct
maybe
your question needs to be directed to Ms. Regal
both
first.
to Ms. Regal? Okay, Ms. Regal.
So the subject site, the existing office building, was determined in the Historic Structures and Sites report to not be significant on this particular parcel. It does speak to the building that is across the shared driveway at 223 East De La Guerra, the neighborhood house that is eligible for designation as a city landmark.
Okay, is that the one that's currently being used by Sonos?
That is the larger building.
Yeah, that's the larger.
Size.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies that for me. Then I'd like to ask you, Ms. Regal, also in the color-coded Exhibit E that we received, and I appreciate that you sent us the color-coded version. I wanted to be clear on the actual boundaries for El Pueblo Viejo. So if you could put the map of historic resources within the original EPV boundary up, I appreciate it. So because there are two shades of gray, I just wanted to be clear for our consideration. Are we looking at, maybe you could just, do you have a pointer and just go kind of street by street and draw the grid for me?
From Laguna,
Okay.
Figueroa, down State Street, and across to Ortega back to Laguna. That is the original EPV.
Okay. Thank you for that. Then I also have a question on, well, let me go to Mr. Mahan. I don't know how long you could be here with us, Mr. Mahan, today, but since you're representing.
As long as necessary.
Okay, great.
He's resting up for his trek back to the parking lot.
Yeah, exactly. I think a number of us experienced that.
I think
with
I'll
Lot
take a
10,
cab
so
back.
We appreciate that. Mr. Mahan, I did watch the HLC hearing on replay, and so if I'm not remembering correctly, maybe you can help fill it out for me. While I heard some very specific critiques and concerns from the commission, what I wasn't clear about, and I'm really looking at number 8 on the minutes, which is that the AUD should be appropriately applied to this site and neighborhood. What I didn't hear much of was how it could be appropriately applied to the site and neighborhood. In other words, if you had concerns with the proposal, what would be more amenable? There's this talk of tiering and terracing and maybe stepping back one or two floors and anything else that might make the commission more comfortable. Can you speak to that? Because I really didn't hear much of that in the commission's deliberations, and I don't see much of that in the minutes.
Yeah, as I said, Barry Winnick, who is our vice chair, he is our expert on AUD. He felt that a lot of the elements of AUD could be incorporated into this particular design, an improved design in terms of density and the size of units, et cetera. But that it couldn't be maximized. This is a site where you just can't come in and build from property line to property line and 4 stories high or 60 feet high. Let's say the charter permits 60 feet, and you just can't. He just didn't think you could do that, and the commission generally agreed with him.
I did hear Mr. Winnick's comment.
This isn't the right neighborhood to do that. I think there are some neighborhoods in the AUD map where you could maximize. And probably that's already been done in some places, maybe down on Gutierrez or Haley Street. I think there's a project that's approved for on the corner of Haley and Salsipuedes, quite a large project. And but this is a very sensitive area in terms of its historic resources, and the commission, Historic Landmark Commission, is very concerned that no design would degrade of the existing historic resources. That's our charter to make sure that doesn't happen. And so a maximize AUD project on this site just would do that. It would degrade the historic resources, and that's why we couldn't find this project approvable.
Okay, thank you for that information. Back to you, Mr. Hockhauser. In the packet that you presented to us, I'd like to look at, I guess it's our page number 5, that the slide is entitled Existing Context, and you have the various color-shaded properties, and some of them represent different building heights. So as you're going to that, what you called out the properties that have the dark yellow lined the outlines, and you mentioned that those are predominantly 3 and 4 stories. I have a question about which yes, so within that first block, for example, the block in question, can you identify the buildings and the number of stories for the dark yellow or heavy yellow outlined properties?
Yeah, well, I absolutely could. So
all I need to know is number of stories. I'm going to hand you my pointer, and maybe that might be easier for everybody to follow you. There you go.
So this is that new 4-story apartment house that's just being completed now, and to help make this really easy to see, I think it's best that we look at the questions and rather than try to describe them.
Okay. So this is an example. This is the Jeff Shelton Dan Upton project, and so this is the 4-story is stepped back. I guess third and fourth. Is that what I'm seeing there? And you okay? Okay.
So then here you've got a 2- and 3-story structure with this 3rd-story mass stepped back in the corner, and then this 2-story building site, which is the potentially historical resource we were just discussing.
Uh-huh.
As you go down, here it becomes 2.5 stories at the corner there. So that's why it's got that light yellow line around it, because it's a 2.5 story.
I see.
And then this is visiting nurse, the old visiting nurse association.
That's on Canna Perdido, that one, that entrance. Uh-huh. That's 3. All right.
Chairman Schwartz, that's the block you were asking about here, just addressing that block.
Okay. Then what I want to do is, on De La Guerra, as we take a public view looking up towards the mountains, so this would be going north. Let's back up on De La Guerra. You have a dark yellow line around sort of a rectangular property. This is in between Santa Barbara and Anacapa, but it's De La Guerra looking towards Santa Barbara. Right there. You had it right there. So how many stories is that?
All of this along here is, this is a 3rd-story tower element. This is all 2-story, 2-story. This is all 2-story. This is extra high 2-story that exceeds the height of a 3-story building right here. This is a 2-story corner element on the Historical Society across the way.
Did you say that that rectangular property, that's a 2-story building but has the height of a 3-story?
That's
Is that
correct.
what you're saying? Okay.
And we have a slide and a tape of that as well.
Okay.
I'd like to also point out, like right in the middle of the Presidio, everybody's familiar with this structure, which is a fairly high 2-story mass structure here as well.
Okay, I think those are my questions on the heights. Let me just see if I had another one. Yes, I have a question back to you, Ms. Riegel. On page 4 of our staff report, in the historic resources element section or discussion, there's a reference to the term neighborhood, and I didn't have time to go through all of our policies to try to find definitions of neighborhood. But could you just confirm for me, do we have either in the historic resources element or any other elements a definition of neighborhood?
That I recall.
Or Ms. Galarte, anybody?
We don't have a specific definition of neighborhood. We just have the different neighborhoods in the general plan, this being a part of the Laguna neighborhood.
Okay, do we have a definition of context if we're looking at context for compatibility and analysis?
Can I answer that question?
Well, no, I want to just see if we specifically have language in any of our policies, Mr. Mahan, hold on. Because, there are personal definitions, and then I just want to see if literally we have anything in our policies or ordinances or guidelines.
Commissioner Schwartz, none that I know of.
None that you know of, okay. I think, Mr. Chair, for now, those are my preliminary questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Mr. Mahan. As I watched the hearing when it first happened, I was struck by the strength of commissioners' feelings about this project, and my recollection is that everyone concurred with the first point. The project as proposed is not acceptable. Is that correct?
That is correct, and we also had 7 or 8 people from the public speak in public comment. That none of them, I can't remember who they all were. Mary Louise
I think some of them are
Hayes,
sitting
Don
behind.
Sharp, and Mr. Siki from the Anacapa School, etc. Kellum DeForest. None of them did support the project either.
Right.
So.
They're sitting behind you, so I expect we'll hear from them. And then number 5, the size, bulk, and scale. I also got the same impression that everyone thought it was not appropriate.
That's true, and the generally accepted criteria for compatibility, for neighborhood compatibility, is you go to the best buildings in the neighborhood and you try to be compatible with those, not the average building or the worst building. Of course, the best buildings in this neighborhood are the Historical Museum and the Presidio redevelopment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Riegel, so I'm like probably some other people, a little less than overwhelmed or excited about adding 7 more voices to this process without with just giving comments without any control. But I'm curious as to the whole process of the concept review. So today what's being shown is one particular concept. We're almost being asked to comment on our opinion on findings, to go back down to HLC. And so let's say it routes around back down there, and they agree then that it's going to be a 2-story lot line to lot line development, but it doesn't come back for a concept review. And at what point does it change so materially in the concept that what we're talking about today isn't really input on the concept?
Well, I mean, I think the applicant's going to come back with a new...
You are putting on another hat there really quick.
The applicant's going to come back with another concept, I suspect. And, I mean, there is a developable project for this site, and I think the applicant and the Historic Landmarks Commission want to work together to find the best solution for the community and for the neighborhood.
I guess my question's more to the process of commenting on a concept that might not be the actual concept.
The Planning Commission is reviewing the project that is before them today. If the project is revised to be a substantially different project, then we would require an additional Planning Commission concept because it's essentially a new project.
So hold your finger up to the wind and decide and bring it back if meets some kind of criteria.
I think if it's similar to what was previously approved,
okay,
or this project, that we would continue down the track to Historic Landmarks
Fair
Commission.
enough. Could you tell me what are there any? Don't ask for help. No. Are there any open yard requirements on the site, and are they in excess or exactly what's needed?
They are meeting the actual R3, R4 standard of 15% and a 20 by 20 area on the ground level.
And that's the minimum?
And then they are providing additional open space areas. So they're meeting and exceeding the R3, R4.
Okay.
And what the AUD ordinance allows is that the 20 by 20 does not need to be on the ground. It can be on any level of the building.
Okay. So they have room to give up there. Okay. And then you reference in the staff report bicycle parking spaces, but you don't really say if that's guest outside, resident, secured. What's the requirement there?
The AUD ordinance does require that they are secured bicycle parking spaces. The basement floor area doesn't show it on the plan, but the version that they viewed with transportation does indicate that the bicycle storage will be in the parking garage.
And our interpretation of secured would be 4 walls and a door?
Yes, something that's lockable.
Okay, it's like, I think Victoria or Alma de Pueblo has something in the bottom there, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Then Mr. Mahan, if you took off your hat of unanimity on the 4th floor and just talk, because you've done this you do this for a living, and if you just talked about the 4th floor, to me, I'm going to have problems today talking about this because I think we're going to get to a point where everybody goes thumbs up or thumbs down on, say, 4th floor, and I don't know that that's an honest thing to vote on. So, is there? To me, it's where it's located, perhaps, and it's also how it's designed architecturally. So, in your mind, just as somebody who does this for a living, is there hope for a 4th floor if it wasn't presented as it was today? If it was in a different spot, if it was in the middle of the building, if you knew more about the architecture, or is just that 4th floor just a non-starter?
I think that the sense of the commission yesterday was that a 4th floor is not supportable.
Okay, and you would take that to mean even if it was moved around or designed really well.
Right. At first, the staff said the 4th floor is. I can't remember if it is. They use some other word, and it's. Maybe it could happen, as you're suggesting. The 4th floor in this particular project is back in the corner and is not probably from a lot of locations on the sidewalk, you wouldn't see the fourth floor because the rest of the building would block it. Maybe from some places you would see it and some places you wouldn't. I think that the commission is not going to support a fourth floor in any location at all. I think they would rather see the building spread out a little bit and not have a fourth floor.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand the process here in that the applicant, City Council wants a safety valve to some degree on comments on the project, and the applicant could benefit from some direction from another city body, like the question Commissioner Michael just asked about fourth floor supportability. So I do want to get to a question in a minute about what are the straw poll questions we're going to be asked. If we could get those sooner than later, that'd be helpful. But my question is about what we're being asked to do right now with regard to general plan consistency. You had said that staff can't make a determination on whether or not the project is going to be compatible with the general plan until you do your environmental review. And I don't know that we can do that either, right? So wouldn't it be better did you not say that? So maybe restate, and that's my question. Can you make a determination based on the information you have now as to whether or not the project's consistent with the general plan?
So if you look at the PRT letter that was attached to your staff report, staff did make a determination where they had concerns about consistency with the general plan. And the issues that I've raised today are those issue areas of concern. We are seeking the Planning Commission's feedback on whether they feel this project complies with those general plan policies. Independently, the environmental review, what I had said about environmental review is that we cannot use the CEQA exemption under section 15183 if the project is found to be inconsistent with the general plan. So it's two separate
So you don't need a complete environmental review in order to make a determination that the project is consistent with the general plan?
That is correct. We do not need the environmental review complete.
That's my question. That answers my question. But I could still use a slide with all the straw poll questions.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. Guideline 15183 requires the decision maker to make a determination of its application. The guideline says that it really is focused on whether or not additional environmental review is necessary for projects that are proposed under a general plan for which an EIR was certified. The determination there at the time of decision, the decision-making body makes that determination. It'll have a recommendation from staff and comment from staff and information from staff, as well as the benefit of the additional studies that are anticipated. However, the HLC will have to make that determination of whether or not the project that they are ultimately reviewing and being asked to provide a project design approval for, whether or not that iteration of the project is consistent with the policies of the general plan and therefore falls within the exemption of 15183. And so that's how you get there. I mean, that determination and an action on the project occur simultaneously.
Okay, if that's all the questions, we'll next go to comments from the public. And I want to remind everybody that the Planning Commission is not the decision-making body. We've talked about it, but just as a reminder, the HLC will be the one to make the decision on the project. We're going to provide input that is hopefully useful to the HLC when they make that decision. First speaker will be Kellum DeForest. You just pull up to the mic on the table there.
Good afternoon. Willem DeForest, and you've got my letter, and I think your task is relatively easy since both the HLC and staff just not find the project consistent with the city's general plan. So I think all you have to do is agree with that and say it's not consistent. And let's see what else can be, what other ideas can be designed for this. Personally, I would love to have somebody come along and make it into a park, but I'm sure that would cost lots of money and is not accessible because it's been an open space for so long. It's part of the Santa Barbara streetscape. I did want to point out on the average unit density incentive program, and I had this in my letter, that, and I don't know whether Mr. Hutcher was involved in this, but as some of you may recall, that getting the average unit density plan, even as an experimental one before the past, took an awful lot of work, and it is just an experimental one. And one of the points of the point is that that any program must recognize and complement the setting and character of the neighborhood properties and be super sensitive to adjacent landmarks. And I don't think this project and its present reiteration does that. Thank you.
Thank you. Elena Alcaro.
Hi, I'm Elena Alcero. I'm a sophomore at the Anacapa School, and I'm just here to represent all the students and tell you about the Anacapa School and the culture that surrounds mainly the courtyard. So in the winter, it's really nice that we can go into the courtyard from 9:40 to 10 o'clock during our nutrition break, and from 12:25 to 1 for our lunch break. And we hang out, we play hacky sack, we eat our food, and it's just a really nice bonding experience outside of the classroom. I've been going there for 4 years, and it's just a really big part of the Anacapa culture and our Anacapa bonding and community. And having it be in shade and being cold during the winter would be a big drawback to the school year. And I also just wanted to say that it would be pretty intimidating to have such a large building looking over all of our school events, and just our school day would be a bit different with such a large building. So on behalf of all the students at the Anacapa School, we hope you will take this into consideration as you review the project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gordon Sicci.
Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you, Mr. Mahan. And thank you, Mr. DeForest. And thank you, everybody that is taking the time to consider this project. I'm Gordon Sicci. I'm the founding headmaster of Anacapa School. We started in 1981. We've occupied 814 Santa Barbara Street since 1984. Our campus has been a historic site since 1893 with the Sloyd School. The stone walls were made by Italians then, and they remain part of the history of the site. The current buildings that are there are World War II era buildings from Fort Hoff Heights Hospital, where aviators who had shrapnel in their eyes and other injuries were cared for after World War II. After that, the buildings were set out in different locations for churches and educational institutions in Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara Junior College put two buildings together, and many GIs started their GI Bill education in those historic buildings. We gained occupancy in 1984 when Santa Barbara City College moved out. We've had two cordial meetings with the developer and the architect, and we do appreciate that with our team and with their team.
We have the following concerns. We're concerned about the proximity of the proposed building to the school's property line. We're concerned about the height of the building, especially toward the rear east, when compared to the previous two-story building approval for the location. We're concerned about the shadow of the building that it will cast throughout the winter over the entire courtyard of the school based upon the shade study prepared by the developer. We're also concerned about the school's privacy with many direct views possible of our boys and girls from the buildings. This has been addressed somewhat in the existing design. We appreciate the HLC's and the Planning Commission's efforts in evaluating ways that the proposed building could become more compatible with the historic nature of the school's property and the school's longstanding operations. I do appreciate the diminutive description of the school campus. I know we're a small school. It is an important property and historic school site, and we are diminutive, and I'll accept that. We would specifically request that the setbacks be increased from the northerly property line. We please also require the developer to screen liberally with layered landscaping to minimize the impact on the school. And lastly, and very importantly, please protect the school during construction, given the extremely sensitive daytime nature of our historic school operations. We've outlined mitigation measures in our letter to you, which I appreciate you taking the time to read. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mary Louise Days.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Mary Louise Days, a historian, retired city planning staff, a member of the board of the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation, and today I'm also representing the Citizens Planning Association Board. I had already pointed out that this site is in the heart of the original El Pueblo Viejo. It abuts to the El Presidio de Santa Barbara State Historic Park. The Anacapa School property is part of the state park. It's operated by the Trust for Historic Preservation. So the 5-foot proposed setback would be really one of the inconsistencies with the city general plan historic resources element. This is also an important archaeological site. The Trust for Historic Preservation appealed the previous project partly because of the incomplete archaeological study that was presented to the Landmarks Commission. The City Council denied the appeal, but it arranged for further archaeological work to be done under the supervision of the Trust, and a considerable number, it's my understanding, of artifact locations were found, but that report has not been presented to the Landmarks Commission. I feel that 4 stories here is definitely not appropriate. There are none close by. It can jeopardize the views due to the height and the narrow setbacks. Landmark adobes are in the same block and a half a block south and west. The Anacapa School facility rents the Roshin adobe, which is just one lot up from the border of the subject property. There are potentially designatable sites and resources surrounding it. This particular site, I've looked into it, it shows vacant as far back as the 19th century. The one-story building that's there, I believe, was built in the 1940s, but the 1893 Sanborn map shows the new Sloyd School on the Anacapa School site, and it shows this property as vacant and owned by descendants of the Presidio. I feel that the high density could impact the historic area, especially with the nearby parking. There's only one parking space proposed for each unit under this process, which could really cause impacts on the museum and similar buildings where they're used to using street parking. And the nearby private parking would end up having to build gates, I suppose. There could be a noise and traffic congestion, and I appreciate one of your commissioners asking about what traffic street improvements might be required by a project here, because I think that could have something to do. The historic resources element provisions would be inconsistent, especially the one that talks about projects development near the Presidio and historic adobes, saying that these projects may be subject to measures for additional protection, such as adjustments in height, bulk, size, and setbacks. The Policy 5 requires that such neighborhoods be, especially those in close proximity to downtown and commercial cores, be protected from development that might transform their historic character. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Unless we have some more speakers that wish to address us on this issue, that's the last public speaker. No one coming forward, so we'll close the public testimony, and it's back to the commission for comments. Okay, Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence. I have a couple of additional questions that have surfaced in my mind since hearing public comment and my fellow commissioners' comments. Ms. Riegel, I want to ask you to try to reconcile some information for me. I'm looking at the pre-app review team comments. This is Exhibit C in our package, and page 2 of 19. This section is A, B, C, and D, and it's under the summary of project compliance with AUD, and I think this goes to a question I thought I heard Commissioner Higgins ask about project compatibility. Now, under density, unless I'm missing something, this states that, as proposed, the project exceeds the maximum number of units, et cetera, 63 dwelling units per acre, 26 total with an average unit size of no greater than 811. But when I look at the proposed project itself, let me go back to the specifics that we've received right here in the staff report, page 3 of the staff report. So maximum allowed 811, proposed is 789, which means it should be under the 811. That's square foot, average square foot. And then maximum units 26, and it looks to me like from the staff report the applicant is proposing 26. So yes, you're nodding. So I have reconciled the math correctly. So is it that what we're seeing in the PRT is no longer applicable to the proposed project that we're conceptually reviewing today?
When the applicant originally submitted his application for PRT, he did have a proposal of 27 units and 865 square feet of commercial.
Okay.
He made some minor changes to the project to bring it into compliance so that the project wasn't halted from going forward, such as meeting the maximum density requirement of 26. So he eliminated a unit and he increased the amount of commercial square footage, and he reconciled his parking. So there are two parts of the PRT letter that have been addressed with his most recent plans, which is 26 units, and the parking calculation is now corrected to reflect the correct number of 30 being proposed.
Okay, so then from our Tuesday site visit, I made a note for myself about something I thought I heard you say, so this would close it out for me. Let me ask you to reconfirm that all setback and minimum requirements under AUD are being met now under the currently proposed project. Is that correct?
That is correct. The zoning ordinance requirements have been met. The minimum setback along the street frontages is 5 feet, and there's 0 setback requirements along the interior and rear property lines.
Okay. Mr. Hockhauser, please.
I think there's a bit of confusion for the commissioners on the idea of setback. These setbacks exceed greatly the requirements of the zoning ordinance and that's granted by the AUD. So we're already providing significant setbacks, and I must add that the setback from the school, while in some places it's maintained what was originally on the approved project, it has been increased. And the height of the essentially two-story element along the school property line for the greatest extent has been reduced from that's been approved by the prior project. So I'm sitting here a little bit intimidated by the thought that we recognize that the height has to come down on a project like this, but the idea that now we're going to be increasing our generous setbacks on De La Guerra and on Santa Barbara Street even further and retreat further from the property line with the Anacapa School when we're already exceeding that of the approved project is getting us to the point where it doesn't make sense to do this project. We have to have a viable amount of space to be realistic and have some reality here. Now, Mr. Mahan just suggested that, of course, he expects when mass comes off the top, which we're seeing that. And unfortunately, I didn't get to remind the Commission that I was not prepared or not allowed to present our thinking on alternative projects since our experience at HLC. We've been verboten to do that. So we're only forced to discuss the project that we have before you. But of course, John Donaldson has been exploring alternatives without the fourth-story mass. So those adjustments are kind of a great concern. And those would be very important for us to hear from the Commission as to kind of what's appropriate in the way of setbacks, because I think that slide illustrates a great deal of what's going on with regard to building height and setback as a pattern that exists all throughout the Presidio and around it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hawkers. I want to go back to Ms. Riegel for a moment. Do we have a slide that shows required and proposed for all the setbacks so that we all can be very clear about what we're looking at?
I don't have a site plan that shows the required setback. I do have the previously approved site plan and the project proposal site plan in a side-by-side view so you can compare what was previously approved.
Yeah, I'm more interested in our required versus proposed, but okay. Okay, my other question then is, I think really back to you, Mr. Mahan, since you're generously spending your time with us this afternoon. As you may know, the previous project was approved with 3 stories. Now, I don't expect you to be able to speak for your full commission, and it's going to go back to you anyway. But should this project be revised to include 3 stories in some form, because there's already a 3-story approved project that could go forward, would you anticipate, it's your guesstimate, that you would approve a 3-story project? You know, all the details being worked out, all the particulars?
Yeah, I think so.
Because they could move forward anyway with a different 3-story project.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think that project went to City Council, didn't it, on appeal?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. But I just wanted to be clear because they can go back and build something that's 3 stories anyway. Yeah. They have that legal,
exactly,
that position. So yes, it would be your sense that you and your colleagues could approve something that's 3 stories. Again, working out the details, kind of pulling out the pencils and fine-tuning things.
I would think so, yes.
You would think so. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For Ms. Riegel, there is no required setback in this zone. It's a C2 zone on the north side. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The approved project, do you know what the setback is on that one and what is being proposed?
I can look at the plans and see if I can tell you.
I also have that information.
You do have that information?
Yes.
Or Mr. Hockhauser?
Well, the approved project had elements that were 3 feet away from the property line, and then the major length of this 2-story element was 10 feet away. The proposed project has elements that are 5 feet away and a greater setback, more like 12 to 14 feet on the majority length.
Okay, thank you. To tell the truth, I was shocked when I saw that this area is in the high priority overlay. I was very much involved in the development of what was finally adopted, and actually drew one of the maps, and it's just totally inappropriate for an AUD project. Is totally inappropriate for this site, It's just that the richness of historic resources and of the buildings around it. The museum is going to be there forever. It's hardly even 2-story on the corner. It's kind of like a story and a half. And so to point to other buildings that are taller, to me, is irrelevant. Now, I think, and perhaps Mr. Mahan could comment on this, that if the proponent could come up with a project that looked like Casa de las Fuentes, which is at about 60 units per acre, that might work, but you would have a much lower per square foot unit to have the same number of units. The other thing that I would suggest is not having any commercial, given the success of Alma del Pueblo of getting tenants for their commercial. Perhaps it might not be a good economic decision, and use that square footage for your residential units. I don't know, Mr. Mahan, might something like that fly, do you think?
I think that's a good example. Casa de la Fuente is 2-story, I think, throughout. There's a 3-story element, but that's because the parking structure is on grade. If the parking structure were below grade, as I think both of these approved applications had the parking structure below grade, Casa de la Fuente would be all 2-story. So
those are my...
That's a very successful project and a very, very good example of high density that really fits into Santa Barbara, yeah.
And it's at a very busy, an even busier intersection than Santa Barbara and De La Guerra, and I've been in the units, and they don't have any right on Carrillo, but there are some on Castillo near the corner, and they're quite livable. So, and given the setbacks you're proposing, I think that if it were an all-residential project and with the feel of Casa de las Fuentes, I personally could accept it.
Suzanne, would you put up the slide that had the list of items that the staff is looking for Planning Commission feedback so we can use that to focus our discussion? Commissioner Jordan.
All right, just had one more question. So, Ms. Riegel, on this talk about setbacks and what they could be, what they couldn't be, regardless of the zoning allowance, whether the setback was 0 or 10 feet or 5 feet, you still have to consider the general plan and the protections allotted to adjacent historical locations in regard to how those setbacks are either complied with at their minimum or a greater level. That would be accurate, right?
It would be consideration whether or not the proposed setbacks are sensitive to the adjacent resources.
He said it much better than me. But just because you could go that far doesn't mean that the situation would allow you to go that far based on consideration of adjacent historical resources.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, these are the items the staff would like Commissioner feedback on, so whenever anybody's ready to start discussing these, we'll do that. Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question. Ms. Riegel, I'm sorry, this is important. I'm looking at these 4 bullet points, but in the staff report, there are 2 additional bullet points. I want to understand why land use element and housing element are not part of our straw poll discussion today.
During my
especially housing, which AUD is a housing policy. So,
during my presentation, I had mentioned the LG6 policy, and then when I got to this slide, I had indicated that these are the issues of concern about consistency. Staff feels that the project does meet the goals of the LG6 and the overarching housing policies. So that's not an area of concern, but you're more than welcome to include that in your comments or motion that you feel that this project is consistent with the housing element policies and the land use policies.
No one wants to make any comments. Maybe we should. Commissioner Jordan.
Okay, I'll go first. If you're just looking for a thumbs up or thumbs down as you go down that list,
Mr. Chair, real quick.
Go ahead.
The straw vote language that I had provided in front of you, I do have a slide, and I don't know if that would be better to use as a format for the
Sure,
discussion.
if you have a slide for what you're looking to get, that would be better. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily need.
Well, after me, anyhow. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
There you go.
There you go.
So do you want to go through
Commissioner
those
Jordan.
one by one as a group, or do you want individuals to go down the list? What would you prefer?
I think that you ought to give your individual comments to each one
Okay.
of those items, and then
Mr. Chair, while Commissioner Jordan is taking the time to read the list, I'd like to kind of remind the Commission, and this has been borne out a bit in our discussion today, that the general plan is replete with policies, some of which push you towards inconsistent goals, and that the exercise for anybody of applying the city's general plan to reviewing a project is a matter of balancing and coming to a conclusion of general consistency with the general plan in consideration of all of its policies. And so while I think that it's useful to pinpoint some of your policies and to speak to them very specifically, however, I believe it would be also very useful for the HLC to hear this Commission's general thoughts of the balancing of the various policies, the housing element policies, the historic resource element policies, and so forth, because that ultimately is the test of consistency with the general plan.
right. And what I'd like you to do is give your feedback on any or all of the points that the staff is looking for information, and then when everybody's had their say, we'll take a straw vote on each one of those items to give the staff objective numbers.
So I can
it'll
do
be a
this
majority vote
pretty easily.
going forward.
I am generally with every one of those but two, do not feel that the proposed project is anywhere near meeting what's on the slide. And the only two that I feel that I don't have a problem with are the noise conflicts between the adjacent land uses and the preserves of mature landscaping and trees. Those are the two least of my concerns on the entire list. And then I will avail myself of Mr. Vincent's thoughts on expounding on that. You know, one of the quotes I've heard both at the HLC and here again today is consistent with guidelines of EPV, which, you know, you put consistent and guidelines in the same sentence, and you already have a whole bunch of reason for leeway there. And I think the location and the adjacent properties don't give you both of those words in the same sentence. I don't think you get to be consistent, and I don't think you get to worry about guidelines. I think you have to be spot on and be better than consistent, and you have to meet more than the guidelines. That's the burden this project at this site is going to carry forward. I'm not really fond of quoting Mr. Lavoie, but I heard him say two things that resonated very well with me the other day, and that was, paraphrasing, that the project needed to be designed really old. I think he gave a years, like 100 years old or 1,700 years old or something, whatever it was. And I think that really resonated with me, given your relationship to your adjacent properties, that a real effort is going to have to go into the design. And his other comment, the second was that the focus has to be on the architecture. And to me, that was part of my question back to Mr. Mahan on the fourth floor. It's really hard when you just have these pictures of these block things on 4 floors. If you had an architectural type of treatment, if you moved it around, could you live with a 4th floor? He's made it pretty clear that that's not the case. But I think that's your two burdens also as you go through that process. You're going to have to design it of a quality and sense that it fits in with the other historic properties there, and the architecture is going to be very clear. And then lastly, I keep hearing that the AUD and protections in the general plan and even the discussion on setbacks are conflicting policy. And they're not conflicting policy. One lets you do something. The other one tells you how far you can go. They don't conflict. One just applies as to what you generally can do, and the other one puts the brakes on a little bit to slow you down in certain situations. And that's all that's happening here. With the process you're going through is exactly what should happen in this particular location. If you took it out of this location, part of that equation wouldn't happen. If you took it over the hill onto the mesa, more of that equation wouldn't happen. So what's happening here is not a set of conflicting policies, but it's a specific policy to take you through this process just as what's happening. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I can sort of appreciate the points you were making, and probably on this commission you might find me to be a little bit more agreeable with property rights than anybody else. But I can't get around the historic resources policies about the projects needing to respect rather than detract from historic resources. And it's hard on one hand, it's hard to be able to make a definitive statement about that because we don't have all of the studies that have been done or updated to give those statements or comments some teeth, but perhaps not. That's not what we're being asked to do now, is give it some real teeth. It's just loose opinions, I guess. So take it for what it's worth. It's my 2 cents. I don't know that, I mean, I can appreciate the point about your slide with the blue circle, the blue square. Are we not really allowed to exercise any AUD projects in this particular area? I think what Michael had said, rings true for me as well. You can, but just because you can doesn't mean you should in terms of maxing out the density. So is the property appropriate for AUD? It could be if the density was cut in half and you could meet those other standards for historic resources. I just wanted to say, too, just a month ago or so, there was a housing conference in town where you had 600 or 800 housing nuts in the same room together for half a day. I was one of them. So I don't see anybody here helping you out with advocating for your project. And so I think the safety valve or the step in the process here with regard to the politics, which you mentioned also, is I'm perplexed at how that's being ignored. Yeah, I don't understand if what the council wants is for the applicant to check in with the city and the planning commission, have a hearing and maybe exercise some politics. You haven't done that, and so I can't imagine this project not coming back to us with a different concept.
Thank you, Commissioner Peugeot.
Thank you. You'll find my comments to be primarily aligned with the first two fellow commissioners that just spoke. But I would like to start with the massing, size, bulk, and scale item. For me, very much of this is about massing, size, bulk, and scale. And I do not see this in terms of whether you can change a setback, whether the height should go up 3 feet or down 4 feet, whether it's 4 stories or 3 stories, because the massing and the bulk is not about technically whether it's got an extra floor on the interior. It's got to do with the way it fits or doesn't fit on the site and in this location. And there is too much massing, and it is too bulky, and it doesn't respect El Pueblo Viejo to the extent and the standards that it needs to, which I agree with Commissioner Jordan, need to be very authentic and high standards. And I also want to make a comment as well in terms of, I think I see it in a basically a more global view than even listed here. I think the closest item for me would be preserve public views of the mountain. Yes, that's important, and there are public views, and I think yes, work needs to be done. But I don't think we're there yet in even being able to talk about that on this project, because the bigger issue to me is the sense of place for this very key historic downtown area. It's the intersections, the people walking from the east side over to the west side through the downtown State Street area. It's the nature of the historic structures that attract tours and give pride to the community, to our heritage. It's the views from the outdoors and the open space areas in that area that are already provided. And all of that includes protecting those not only views of the mountains, but also the public views from place to place in that particular area. And again, I think the scale of this project does not allow for that. I do have a slightly, perhaps, different view on one item, or at least a permutation on it. I do think that the commercial and public aspect of the proposal doesn't go far enough. I find the commercial spaces to be less than appropriate for this important corner, and whether it's an office or a grocery store or a art gallery or a chamber of commerce, visitor bureau, a bit of a, like a small historical museum itself, perhaps, I don't know. But it's more that to have this important corner on this intersection be entirely basically designed inward to the residential uses and not outwards to this important area, I think is not quite up to that sense of place that we see in those policy statements that we need to protect. I could comment on some of the other ones on the historic resources, I suppose, specifically. I think that's encompassed in my comments already, but I do think that that we need to enhance the respect of the existing historic resources, not and do no harm. First, do no harm, and I think that we're not there yet on this. So all the rest to me are, in a way, details, because the development of the design and the project itself and the environmental review will bring some of that information to bear. But those larger ones, I think, are important enough that I can't imagine that modifications to this proposal would be sufficient enough to not basically mean a whole new kind of concept. And so I would expect that most likely we'll be seeing it back at Planning Commission, because I think it's more than a little bit of change that's required.
Okay, Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really like the way Commissioner Jordan put it. Well, and it relates back to developers coming in and asking for the absolute maximum that the ordinances allow. It doesn't mean that it's right, that it's appropriate, or approvable. And, and there aren't conflicts, there just are limitations in different ways. Anyway, specifically on the items that are on the screen, I could say yes to number 1, and I could say yes to number 4 about noise. Otherwise, it's no to the rest.
Okay, Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I envisaged a day like today when, in 2010, when Commissioners Jordan, Lodge, and I were wrestling with over 3,000 pages of a general plan update and ultimately led to the Council's decision on AUD, I knew that the tensions inherent between a higher density housing policy by the way, that has now been ratified by the State Housing and Community Development Department. So we also have legal obligations to incent certain types of rental housing. Within our historic boundaries, the EPV area of the city, we're going to give rise to these types of tensions that we're discussing today. I don't know how to actually apply the word balance. I like to use the word balance typically, but I don't even know if that's realistic in this case, given those tensions. We have a dire need for rental housing. The question is, in a city that's 90% built out, where can we find that real estate? And where can it be appropriately applied? So going down this list, the project is consistent with the goals and policies for rental housing projects. However, now I go to number 2. I think given the limited information that's been brought to the Commission today, because it's such an early concept review, I can't say that it preserves public views of the mountains. I would need an artistic rendering, visual simulation, something like that to have a better sense, which, by the way, we have received on other concept reviews, but we don't have it here before us today. So I can't say with any certainty that it preserves public views of the mountains regardless of mass, bulk, scale, and height. Next, site planning for the new residential use located non-residential. I think more work is definitely needed and will happen with HLC and staff on the siting of the project, whether it's this project or any other residential project. It is appropriate, and there are other residential structures right within this immediate area. And the reason I asked about a definition for neighborhood and a definition for context is, as I suspected, we still do not have one in the city. It's something our commission wrestles with, and the review boards wrestle with. And I am pursuing, with Jaime Limon, this Santa Monica new Santa Monica methodology for contextual analysis. This was brought to our commission recently because I think we need some firm definitions for contextual analysis of project compatibility. So a lot of it is discretionary and it's subjective, and it's individual decision makers making these decisions today on something that's very important to the community, to applicants, and I don't think we have a good yardstick there. So I'm hoping that we develop something like that. Now, site plan prevents noise conflicts between adjacent land uses. I think prevents is too strong a word. I don't know how you can prevent noise. Well, noise conflicts. I don't even know what noise conflicts actually, how that actually is defined as noise conflicts. You know, you can say there's a school next door when all of the students are out in the courtyard. If somebody were, you know, residentially right next door, they could say that's a noise conflict for them because we have a school there. I think inherent in a highly urbanized setting, I know even where I live, near the Santa Barbara Bowl and Santa Barbara High School, I can tell you there are lots of noise conflicts, but I think we accept that being urban dwellers, quite frankly, and I think we have to just figure out how to live with our neighbors for multiple uses. Okay, preserves historic character. This is where I have probably the greatest concern, and I think much more work needs to be done on how to develop the architecture, the nuances of all of that, the beauty of the building, terracing, tiering, stepping it back. I'm looking, Mr. Hockhauser, at some of the photographs in the package that you provided, and I think there are examples, some of them referenced today, by other neighboring architectural styles that you would be wise to employ as you go back to HLC, not to be identical with, but reference some suggested, some respected references that would help create a blend that perhaps HLC would be more comfortable with and that would be approvable. I don't know what those is, and we're not designing that. We're not designers, and we're not designing that today. Appropriate in mass bulk scale. Here again, I mean, I hear Commissioner Puzo's comments. For me personally, I don't have enough detail as to what this concept, how it might be realized or actualized or implemented to even know what the mass bulk scale is and whether or not it's appropriate. So I feel that I really can't comment on kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down there. I would need more detail. Artistic renderings, again, visual simulation, something along the lines of what we've received in other concept reviews. Sensitive to adjacent federal, state, and local historic resources, I feel I've commented on that for the most part. I think if you incorporate some of my suggestions, increased sensitivity could be found. And I'm hoping to the extent that with some compromise by HLC, you could find some common ground there since they'll be the decision makers, unless at some point it goes to City Council. Is sensitive to adjacent, same thing, El Presidio. Preserves mature landscaping. As I always say, please do everything possible to retain the mature and desired landscaping and trees. I think, again, as it goes back to HLC, you'll probably work on that. I want to then just close by saying both this commission and City Council have made a very clear value statement for the city, and now we've codified a priority in our policies for actively incenting rental housing. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us as decision makers, including Mr. Mahan, HLC, to work very cooperatively to the best of our collective abilities to find a way to have a buildable, a feasible rental housing project on this site. And with all the talent on HLC and on the applicants team, I'm going to say today that I am truly hopeful and cautiously optimistic that that can be achieved because I think we owe that to the community. It is a legal obligation we have to incent rental housing. So I would just ask HLC to please keep that in mind as you look at the aesthetics of this and the historic resources concerns. And I'm hoping for something positive as it goes back to HLC, since we are not the final decision makers on this particular project that's come to us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I've got a couple of comments. We've been talking about all the things that the project isn't. There are some very positive things, and I give you credit for bringing a proposed affordable housing project to the downtown core, which the city has said we want to do. You've taken the city's priority housing overlay to heart, and you've done that. The underground parking, I want to commend you for underground parking. I know it's not cheap to do an underground parking lot, but it certainly enhances the building in the downtown core. And the step-back approach to the architecture is certainly an attempt to meet a lot of the requirements for views and so forth. But as a lot of people have pointed out already, and I won't belabor it, this is a great project, but it would be better in a different location. It's got to be sensitive to the historical context that's immediately adjacent to the project. And it points out, I think Commissioner Jordan described it the best, points out that even though the AUD housing policies would allow a maximum, it doesn't require a maximum. And in this context, we have to cut back from what the maximum might allow and give some consideration to the historical nature of the surrounding neighborhood. So what I would like us to do is we'll take a straw vote on each one of these items because the staff would like to have that. And Ms. Rodriguez, will you take a record of the vote on each one of these? So how many commissioners believe that the proposed project is consistent with the rental housing goals and policies? Looks like we're unanimous on that. How many commissioners feel that the proposed project preserves public views of the mountains?
I'm going to have to abstain if that's a way to vote because I can't tell from the details we have today.
I can abstain as well. I'd like story polls, but
Yeah, I agree. I abstain as well.
Okay.
Some other kind of vote on that.
Okay, so nobody agrees that it preserves the views, 3 abstain, and 3 think that it does not. How many commissioners feel the proposed project site planning for the new residential use located in a non-residential zone is compatible with the adjacent land uses?
Mr. Chair, I would need clarification on even exactly what that means because if we're talking about the fact that it's residential in non-residential, that's one kind of question. But if it's this particular manifestation of the residential use at the project level, then I think I would have a different answer.
Also,
So-
Mr. Chair, there is residential above the restaurant Julian. There is residential in this neighborhood already. So regardless of what it's zoned, this is a mixed use. On the land, it's mixed use occupancy today. So I think to Commissioner Peugeot's question, it's a little confusing, though.
Yeah, this question is a little bit, what would I say, out of context. If it was a different area, we're talking about residential use in a non-residential zone. Certainly, it's a mixed-use project. But if you throw in the historic uses immediately adjacent, if that's your intent here, that changes the flavor, I think. So
The intent was the particular project and its current site plan. Is it compatible with, as residential?
Presidio and the historic buildings, and I would say no. And I don't know how many other commissioners.
That's a unanimous no.
Okay.
Do we need to phrase that in terms of
I
a
have to abstain.
hand
This,
or-
to me, this is a confusing and it's not quite applicable.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Vincent.
Rather than attempting to just go down this list, or at least with this particular question, I would recommend that maybe a commissioner make an affirmative statement regarding whether or not
We're
this
trying to do what the staff asked us for.
and I'm trying to. I think this is an important point, and it's important. I believe that the applicant and the HLC will find your input on this issue important. I believe the idea is: does the project as proposed, with the residential uses as proposed,
Is it compatible with the adjacent?
Are they compatible with the adjacent uses?
Yeah. Okay, Commissioner Higgins.
Just to clarify or beat it up, I don't know which one, but I don't think the site plan works, but I think there's room for residential uses on the property.
Mr. Chair, I was going to suggest just dropping site plan planning, saying new residential use located in a non-residential zone is compatible with the adjacent land uses, and that I could say yes to.
I agree with Commissioner Lodge.
Is that what?
Okay.
That I would say yes to new residential use located, et cetera.
And I would agree with that,
So
Commissioner.
just to clarify, now we're not talking about it in the project-specific sense, but in a general, does residential use fit
Just
within
removing
this area?
site planning.
For this,
site planning. Take that
remove
out.
the site planning. Okay, so in a general concept, I would agree that it fits. Residential uses fit.
I say yes.
That makes sense to you, Suzanne, if you take out site planning or new residential uses located here. Does that satisfy everybody, Mr. Vincent?
That's where I was suggesting you go.
Okay. I think we're all yeses. Okay, does the proposed project prevent noise conflicts with adjacent land uses? How many people have any feeling one way or the other on that one?
I abstain.
Yeah, I abstain because I don't even think that it's a worthy question to me.
Yeah, how many people think that it's a yes? Does not.
Mr. Chair?
Okay, yeah. And,
Yeah, okay.
okay. 2 say that it prevents noise conflicts, and 3 abstain. And
May I comment? The reason
Yes, go
I'm
ahead.
abstaining, just so staff is clear, when I read the noise element, to me, without further clarification about what prevention of noise conflicts is, it's too absolute and I think unreasonable. In general, so I wouldn't even know how to apply it. So, reasonably, so that's why I'm abstaining.
Mr. Chair, we'd be assuming that the project, that the applicant would be held accountable to the noise standards in the code before it could be
Right.
approved. So in theory, it's incumbent upon the applicant to make that happen.
Yeah.
But we don't have that information. So, I mean, my assumption is that it would obviously comply.
Okay, now we get to the meat of the issue and how many people that think the proposed project preserves the historical character of the surrounding neighborhood. Is there any? How many think that it does not?
With the details that I have today, I can't say that it does, but I think it can get there. I need to qualify it by saying that. This is what I said to Mr. Mahan. I'm going to put it back over in HLC.
How many commissioners feel that the proposed project is appropriate in mass, bulk scale, setbacks, and the height of the structures in the surrounding neighborhood?
I'm going to abstain because I don't see enough of the mass bulk scale to even know if it does without an artistic rendering or digital simulation.
No one agrees, one abstention. How many commissioners feel that the proposed project is sensitive to the adjacent? In fact, these next two are really the same question. And how many commissioners feel that the proposed project is sensitive to the adjacent historic resources in the historic Presidio Park? I think it's 0.
I'm abstaining again. I don't have enough. I don't have enough details.
And how many commissioners feel that the proposed project preserves mature landscaping and trees?
I'll take one of those abstentions down there and vote yes.
Okay.
I'll go with yes. From what
Anyone else? Then there was just two of us.
I could probably go with a yes on that.
Okay. So 4 yes, 2 no. Okay, does that get the definitive numbers that you were looking for? Kind of a convoluted way to do it, but this will go back to the Historic Landmarks Commission for another concept review before it gets final. And I would anticipate that there'll probably be some changes going back to the HLC. Whether or not it comes back to the Planning Commission is up to the applicant. He can request to come back to the Planning Commission. And I suppose if the changes are significant enough, the HLC could send it back to us again. But otherwise, we won't be seeing it again. So, Mr. Mahan, did you want to make any comments?
I just want to thank you for your deliberations, and the Historic Landmarks Commission will study your comments and be advised by them. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Hockhauser, do you want to make any closing comments?
I would appreciate that. I do appreciate the work and the time everybody's taken to work on this project and talk about it. I had hoped that we would have gotten a little bit more specific feedback on where to go. We understand the general commentary as to Commissioner Jordan's comments about threading a needle between two policies and that there has to be a balance both ways. So there's no given that you can maximize everything under the entitlement envelope or the specific zoning envelope. But working with HLC, it's kind of like when we have an approved project that has a given setback from a property line, and that's approved by HLC, City Council, and Planning Commission, and that does not set some threshold for us as a setback, that's a little disturbing and quicksand, if you will, because that setback, that height was already studied relative to that issue on this site. The fact that we've given greater setbacks on street frontages, no guidance really to HLC or us as to how to fold that into a new solution. Basically, this commission has just said, hey, this proposal, this concept, is not consistent with the policies that were listed today. We knew that coming in, and we didn't really get into any discussion or bantering between HLC and the commissioner's purview as to, given our slide of context and mass, well, what would feel an acceptable mass from the standpoint of Commissioner Higgins, Commissioner Jordan? We understand it's not what we showed, but one of the commissioners alluded to that, would you accept the 3-story mass? And I was glad to hear there was some room on that point. But that's the venue we're working in, and I hope we don't have to come back. I hope we're really in a good place working together. Bill and I know each other for years, and I look forward to solving the problem. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reigel, any comments from staff?
If you have additional comments that you would like to provide to the HLC, that's fine. These considerations that I had presented to you were part of the neighborhood compatibility analysis, and they are framed a little strange because of taking those ordinance criteria and framing them in the form of a question. So that's where some of the strange language came from about the site planning, new residential uses in a non-residential zone came from.
So if I were to summarize, without trying to put words in everybody's mouth, a residential project is certainly approvable there. We've pretty well established that, but it has to be cognizant of the historic nature around it. You're in one of the most sensitive spots in the city, next to the origins of the city, so we can't ignore that. But as far as further design details, I guess you and the HLC are probably going to work it out, and I have confidence that you'll come up with a good design and that the HLC will work with you on that. Commissioner Jordan, you had another comment?
Well, I was just invited to make some, so I just want to make some that are more internal comments, but I'm still extremely uncomfortable. This is the first one of these, so I know we get the training wheels on and we'll learn from this, but I'm still, I feel like in given some respect to the applicant, this really was set up as a gang up on the applicant's project. He was, because of the go to HLC, come to PC, go back to HLC, and notification timelines and that sort of thing. I saw that conversation because he had that conversation at HLC with, can I come back here first and talk about probably 3 floors instead of 4 floors before I have to go to there and then come back, and it just, as we're hopefully fine-tuning this process, I think this is one of the takeaways to take from it, that he probably knew coming in he was in trouble, and now he knows he's in trouble, and he's got to go back to HLC, but he also didn't get put in a venue where we could also talk about what he'd already like to talk about in his mind as a different concept, knowing how that first visit was. So that's one of my little, it's a new thing, training wheels thing. And the other one is just the having a little more upfront knowledge on what a trigger would be for a material change in concept and what that looks like. I felt very hemmed in by the process today at just looking at the yes or no's. Just like I say, vote on a 4th floor, vote no, yes or no on a 4th floor. Can I live with 3 floors? Probably. Can I live with, to the question, could I live with setbacks that were very small on De La Guerre and Santa Barbara Street to get away with the school? Probably. I'm not designing the project, though, at HLC. But these are kind of inputs, I think, that the process will still require, but it's not reasonable to expect him to go bouncing back and forth between the 2 commissions on a monthly basis. So I think there's some work to do still here on this process, and it probably goes back to the original conversation with some of us that, maybe this process is just flawed by procedure rather than how it's working. Just to come here is possibly just a flawed procedure, and it should just stay there and get worked out. So,
Commissioner Jordan, one comment, if I may. It's important because I was a little taken aback by the start of this meeting because of what happened at HLC. I presume, Bill, last night was the preparation of minutes for today. And it seemed to me that those minutes were reconsidered and crafted expressly for this meeting, and we never had an opportunity to attend or notify. Usually minutes are created at the meeting that you attend, and then they're just ratified. But it certainly appears to me that the discussion on several points at much greater length was made about this project without the benefit of our attendance. That, to me, feels, whether legally or not, it feels entirely unfair. Because there was some nuance to some of these positions, and they seem to have made a difference here today. So that's frustrating.
I'll just, from my perspective, I can tell you, I took nothing more from the minutes that I saw today versus last week. It was just as bad as it was to me last week.
Right.
Okay,
Understood.
and from when I watched the hearing. I mean, so just if you want one person's perspective, I don't think there was anything more in what we received today that colored my perception of what I watched at HLC. And in my opinion, it was probably much more accurate than what I was given.
Well, we're excited to move on and work with HLC. And what we really wanted to summarize with was we recognize there's an approved project on the site. We hope that the AUD overlay, the balance of policies that the city is trying to apply, will allow us to move to a medium between that approved project and a project that truly works. And I think everybody understands what it takes to make a project work with all the features, historical details, and underground parking. And we look forward to working with the talent that's on the HLC. So, thank you.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you. My general comment, which really reflects my chafing at the process, and I was one of the commissioners who thought that the ultimate process was that the Planning Commission should have a firm vote on AUD projects. I think what I've experienced today and what I'm witnessing overall reaffirms why I thought that would have been beneficial, and most of the council members believe that as well, and that's because we have the broadest lens. When you look at page 2 of our staff report, there are 6 general plan elements here that need to be considered, and with all due respect to all of the review boards, they have narrower lenses through which they apply their expertise and experience. They're considering city policies, ordinances, and guidelines, and for especially a test housing policy that has a particular sunset period, every project that comes through the city needs to be very sensitively and carefully considered, not to just constrain it, but make sure we're really doing the best job we can to apply the policy vis-a-vis the goal of the policy, the intent of the policy. And so my concern about it coming to Planning Commission for just a concept review, given the back and forth we've had today, is I don't know that we're doing justice to the policy or ultimately the community, but it's kind of what we're left with. And this is why I'm imploring the HLC through you, Mr. Mahan, to please, it may be less comfortable for HLC, but to please consider as many general plan policies as staff can assist you to consider that probably are outside of your more traditional lens, because of the very important aspect of rental housing that we struggled with during the general plan process, the council struggled with, and finally approved in 2011, and with this ordinance going into effect in 2014. So that's my plea to HLC, and to help the applicant find a way to put something on this property that's not the luxury condos that they already have approval to build. That will not help us advance our rental housing needs. So I'm looking forward to following HLC's work with the applicant on that. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, when I was on Planning Commission, we had a liaison from Planning Commission to HLC. In fact, I was that liaison. I don't know if that's still in force now. Well, it's for the Planning Commission liaison to speak to the HLC about these particular issues that you're talking about.
Mr. Chair, I have thought that my role was to observe, which I do usually from home on my computer, and to report back to the Planning Commission. I didn't think it was my role to make comments to the HLC. Now, Ms. Ghilardi, am I wrong in that understanding, or Ms. Riegel?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Lodge, the past PC liaisons, when they have attended the meeting, and especially on more controversial or larger scale projects, have spoken to some policy issues. They don't always choose to speak, but if there's something that they're requesting the HLC speak about and provide comment towards the Planning Commission on, it's important that they're present to do so, or at least send an email to the planner or the HLC secretary or ABR secretary, so that message gets conveyed that we need the commission to address the concern.
Okay. Well, I will take my role differently then. And I concur in general with Commissioner Schwartz's comments, I was also opposed to the council's decision, which I think was based on making the process a little less expensive and onerous for the applicant by not having to come for a regular full hearing where the Planning Commission can take up all the issues involved. And that was, I think, why they went this route. But I think it is ultimately inefficient and ineffective and inappropriate. Thank you.
Well, as originally approved, we had no role in it. And after the first couple went around, the council changed it to where anything over 15,000 feet has to have a concept review at the Planning Commission. So if this project lot was 3,500 square feet smaller, we wouldn't be here today. And that's just a arbitrary trigger point for Planning Commission hearings. So, Mr. Mahan?
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I have a meeting at the courthouse at 4 o'clock, and I didn't realize how fast time was flying by, so I've got to leave.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you for being here and your input. And Commissioner Peugeot.
Just closing comments to weigh in on this just a little bit. From my perspective, our role actually is clear. We don't have all the details of the project, but if there are those important policies that affect the direction of the city or an important aspect of the city overall, and we can see that there's a mismatch, even if it was just a box drawing of the basic outline of the building. Sometimes you can tell that. Then I think we're fulfilling our role in weighing in on that so that when it goes back to the Historic Landmarks Committee, they can work within the project proposal to get it into as close conformance as possible, knowing what the big ticket items are, let's say. And that's the way I look at this review. And just to reiterate my main views on this today is that the big ticket items are, it's the very center of our downtown core. It's our most historic area of the city. We have pages and pages of policies to not only protect, but as good policies really should, to preserve, protect, and enhance and further these important goals, not just almost meet them. And right now, because of the massing of the project primarily, and because of the important node of the downtown area in that intersection and activity area for downtown, it doesn't do that. So I think that message alone is an important message to go back to historic landmarks. And if there is a project, I don't know if I would call it revision, but an exchange of project concept that would change that, then I think we're looking at something else. But right now, it just doesn't do that, and I think it's at a very core level. And so that's the kind of decision overall that I think Historic Landmarks doesn't really delve into, because they look at basically more the small p policy design issues and standards and trying to make it the best shape it can be in, given that it's a proposal. Whereas I think for the Planning Commission, we have a role in looking overall for generally, is this fitting right now? And right now it doesn't. And I think that's my message.
Okay. Any other comments on this item from the commission? Good luck, Mr. Hockhauser, when you go back to HLC. Next item on our agenda is committee and liaison reports. Staff hearing officer report.
Just two quick items. Last week, Mr. Chair, nothing out of the ordinary. One of them I always perk up and I'm happy to see was a starting permit issuance for a T fire house rebuild. But it just needed some, approvals for rebuilding in the existing property lines that encroached a little bit. But it's always good to see another one of those firehouses get rebuilt. So, thank you.
Okay, any other committee reports? Commissioner Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yesterday's HLC meeting, Historic Landmarks Commission meeting, a lot of time was spent on the minutes because the draft minutes, which were in our packets, really did not reflect their comments, particularly relating to its being appropriate in terms of the historic resources. And so they spent a lot of time on that. And even the final approved minutes didn't quite reflect the strength of their feeling about the inappropriateness of the project that we just reviewed. They also reviewed the Montecito Country Club. That's still going through the process, and this was largely about the design of the swimming pool and the landscaping. The other item which they spent a lot of time was the bench that is near what's used to be called Hamburger Habit. I guess it's just called the Habit now, on State Street. The artist is willing to have it moved. He was pleased with the site that was chosen, the alternative site near the train depot on a little triangle of grass. But one of the commissioners pointed out that was all part of the renovation to help recreate the way the landscaping was around the station originally. And so the motion that they approved, sorry, I didn't write it down, I should have, but generally it was that it was okay to move it if they could find an appropriate site.
So the railroad's not appropriate.
Yeah, they considered that site inappropriate. They wanted one more intimate, one where people would actually be walking by. There were a lot of very nice comments about it as a work of art. And so city staff's going to be going back and also the Art and Public Places Committee had approved this site. They'd had a considerable discussion about it and about moving it. The commission recognized that it was an attractive nuisance where it was, and so I think it will get moved eventually, but they need to find another location. Library Plaza was before them again, and they got final approval. And we're discussing details, the redo of it to make it more open. There's some places where you can kind of hide and be out of sight, which were of concern to the police department and so on. So that got final approval, and Arlington Village got final approval. That's the project next to the Arlington Theater. There were a lot of, they had come back for specific details like the tile and so on. There's some really lovely detailing that's going to go into that project. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Peugeot? Okay. Seeing no other committee reports, unless anybody has anything else to bring up, we're going to be adjourned.
When we started painting